Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. For the last few weeks, we've been discussing fiscal dominance, and on Monday, we started to dive into fiscal dominance specifically in the United States. Debt in the United States is incredibly high. This places a burden on spending, and so the United States wants to reduce this debt burden. This occurs through increasing economic growth or by lowering debt. Lowering debt often occurs by inflating the debt away. Trump is cutting interest rates in an effort to incite economic growth, but at the same time, inflation remains elevated at 3%. This could see Trump pursue both economic growth and elevated inflation to reduce the debt burden. Because inflation plays such a vital role in fiscal dominance, today we're going to explore if the United States in the future will experience any inflationary pressures. We're going to start by discussing demand-based inflation. Demand inflation occurs when too much demand chases too few goods. When consumers, businesses, or governments increase spending at a faster pace than the economy can expand production, prices rise. Typical indicators of demand inflation include strong consumer spending, low unemployment with rising wages, housing booms, and high demand for travel. Can we currently see any of these indicators in the US economy? In September 2025's inflation data, outside of gasoline and shelter, the aspects of the CPI basket that rose the most were airline fares, recreation, household furnishings, and apparel. These are typically indicators of demand-side inflationary pressures. The most important consideration here is that these are domestic issues that the United States has influence over. Because demand-side inflation can be addressed, Trump is seeking to limit the potential impact that demand-side inflation could have by increasing US production via his tariff-negotiated deals with other nations. This is seeing a lot of investment coming into the United States from abroad. We've seen this recently with the deals with Japan and South Korea. Because both Japan and South Korea need the United States for security, they were bound to make deals. This foreign investment targets specific industries, boosting supply without significantly inflating demand across the entire economy. South Korea, this occurred in the shipbuilding industry, where the United States is seeking to build resilience. The most important point to note here is that targeted investment won't push up prices across the economy. So, Trump's aim here is that by channeling investment from abroad, the United States can lower rates and increase growth, potentially without increasing inflation. But the issue here arises because both an increase in domestic spending and foreign investment can happen at the same time. This could see inflation rise from increased domestic spending, despite growth also increasing from foreign investment. Domestic spending ultimately depends on the status of the general US consumer, which we will discuss in a few minutes. If Trump cuts rates and inflation rises, fiscal dominance enters the picture. Further issues with inflation arise when we turn to supply inflation. Issues of supply inflation are less controlled by the United States, and this is why Trump is seeking to expand domestic manufacturing. What issues of supply-based inflation could we see arise? Before diving into the details, supply inflation can occur when rising production costs or reduced supply forces prices higher. When inputs such as labour, energy, or materials become more expensive, firms pass the higher costs onto consumers. Supply-based inflation can also occur due to supply chain constraints, as we saw during COVID. Typical signals of a supply-based inflation are oil price spikes, supply chain bottlenecks, reduced food output, and higher wages. We are seeing Trump use tariffs to bring nations to the negotiating table. This is leading to investment in the United States, but the tariffs are a double-edged sword. Tariffs increase the cost to import goods from elsewhere before domestic production can compensate. As a result, production costs rise, or importers will reduce the amount of supply that they are importing to compensate for the increased costs from tariffs. If this increased cost is passed on to consumers, we have a prime indicator of supply-based inflation. We also mentioned supply chain constraints as a potential cause of supply-based inflation. The Global Supply Chain Pressure Index, also known as the GSCPI, is currently hovering very close to its average value. This indicates that supply chain constraints are very unlikely today, unless forced by a massive global shock. In considering specific areas of supply, the United States is strong in necessities such as food, energy, and other areas such as services and technology. This ensures that the United States can meet some of its most important needs domestically. But we've seen in the last few months, there are areas where the United States can be hurt when it comes to supply. Generally, the United States is weak in manufacturing depth, in rare earths, and in critical minerals. China's control over global production and supply chains makes this a risk to supply-based inflation in the United States. But in general, the United States is only susceptible to supply-based inflation in these certain areas of weakness. These areas of supply weakness also include apparel, household furnishings, and low-level electronics. And as I stated earlier, we are seeing inflation rise in the apparel and household furnishing sectors. But since apparel and household furnishings are necessities, the United States could absorb this inflation because consumers could well change their spending patterns. They could hold off on making purchases, or they could not make them at all. As a result, supply-side inflation, despite the US vulnerability in some areas, is manageable in the current global trade environment. Of course, these factors can shift, and it's notable that the US-China relationship is continuing to slowly decline. But for now, demand-side inflation looks to be a bigger threat than supply-side inflation in the United States. However, we do need to consider the third option. Rising inflation isn't guaranteed, despite many analysts stating that inflationary pressures do remain in the United States. It's easy to cherry-pick data based on the story and the narrative that we want to tell, but that's not what we want to do here today. And so we also need to explore the other side. Are we seeing any economic indicators that are showing declining inflationary pressures? Some indicators are implying uncertainty when it comes to the potential for increased domestic spending in the United States, which would contribute to demand-side inflation. We are seeing unemployment slowly rise, which could well see a shift in household spending patterns, although this pattern typically depends on financial stress. In relation to household spending patterns, we're also seeing wage growth remain elevated, but it is in a declining trend. Disposable personal income also remains relatively flat, but student loan delinquencies have been rising in the last few months. But the overall delinquency rate on all loans remains low by historical standards. On the flip side, in September, we saw US gross domestic product revised upwards on the back of strong consumer spending. Some of these indicators imply that inflation could well rise, while others imply that we could see disinflation in the United States. In summary, the indicators of domestic spending are mixed. If consumers in general are financially strong, then lower rates could stimulate borrowing, spending, and rising asset prices, which could potentially fuel demand-side inflation. On the flip side, weaker consumer positions could mute these effects, keeping inflation in check despite lower rates. The personal saving rate has also been relatively flat, which doesn't help in determining the position of the US consumer and which direction inflation could move in, because high savings can dampen inflationary pressures. So, with the US consumer being in a mixed position, this raises uncertainty when it comes to future inflationary expectations and fiscal dominance. Despite where future inflationary expectations lie, the Trump administration looks set to pursue lower interest rates. What I've discussed today could well be negated if inflation doesn't begin to rise, as some economic indicators do support. Despite this uncertainty, I still believe that today's discussion is an important one. Suppose that US debt continues to rise because there are no efforts being made to reduce the debt burden. This is the reality that we're seeing today. If this continues without any effort to address it, then the exact scenario of fiscal dominance is relevant for the next time we enter into a similar environment with the potential for low rates and rising inflation. If this scenario of low rates and rising inflation does arise in the future, the question then becomes, could the United States successfully navigate this environment to reduce the debt burden, or would they fail? If they did fail, what would this look like and where would it lead? We'll answer this question in next episode. If you enjoyed this episode, why not leave a review on the podcast platform of your choice? It really helps out the podcast. The 20% offer for my premium readership over on Substack still exists. That will last until January 3rd. If that takes your interest, there will be a link to Substack in the episode description. I've been Dylan. I'll talk to you next time.